Hi, my name is Cassandra, and this is the Healing Grief Podcast. In this episode, I'll be talking about the loss of my mother, Janelle. The loss of my mother is the whole reason I'm doing this podcast, so I feel like this is the story that I've been working on in my memoir, but I'm going to put it down here in the podcast because I want to get the story out, and I'm going to have to break it up into two episodes because it's a very complicated story. So my mom was born and raised in Calumet, Michigan, and she lived in Minneapolis for a little while when she was about two or three, but mostly her family was raised up in Calumet, and that's in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Um, my grandfather Jim, his mom was from Finland, and then my mom's mom Janet. I'm not sure of where when her family came over, but my mom was 100% Finnish. They belonged to a church at the time. It was the Finnish Apostolic Lutheran Church, but now they call it the First. And it's a very tight knit church. People really stuck together in that church. Um, they had really strict rules at the time. I think they're kind of more lapsed now. I'm not sure. I was actually baptized in this church, but I never, practice it. I just remember there are certain things that my mom wasn't supposed to do. She wasn't supposed to dye her hair. You're not supposed to dance. You're not supposed to wear jewelry. You weren't supposed to watch TV, watch movies, like anything worldly, I guess, that could bring them away from the church. They're really wary of. Um, so my mom was raised in Calumet. She went to Calumet High School and graduated in 1980. And after that, she traveled around with some friends. She was in Minneapolis for a while and in Mackinac Island. And after that, two of her friends and her decided to go down to Galveston, Texas. They decided to go to Galveston because it was an island. They were looking on the map and they saw it was an island. They said, okay, let's go there. So, my mom being one of eight kids, she was the third. There was five girls and three boys. And the kid after her was my uncle Glenn. And Glenn had a Dodge pickup truck, red Dodge pickup truck, and that's what my mom bought from him, and they went down to Galveston in that truck. And along the way, they applied for jobs and stuff, and mostly my mom got the jobs because she had the most experience as a maid. She was a maid at hotels. And so they get down to Galveston and they were camping and, getting to know the area. And she was spending a lot of time outside. They're really adventurers and they wanted to get away from the cold upper mission. Like the upper peninsula is really crazy in the winter, like feet and feet of snow. There's even, when you drive up there, there's even a measuring stick that you drive by that's like, I don't know, 20 feet, 30 feet tall, and it shows like the highest amount of snow that they ever got. There's a lot. So her and her friend Heidi and Sue, they wanted to escape. So they're down in Texas and they knew, eventually they were going to have to leave. And this is something I just found out literally a couple weeks ago was one of the girls, Heidi, had a dream that Mom, Sue, and Heidi rode bikes up back to Calumet. And you're you're talking about like Galveston is like the bottomest part of United States, and Calumet is almost the top. Like if you look on the map, and it's like the top of the Upper Peninsula. So my mom was like not for it. She was like, I don't know about that. I don't know. And then they said, Janelle, if we do this, she'll get really tan, really skinny, and really blonde. And she was like, okay, okay, let's do it. So they decided to do it. Heidi and Sue had money from income tax money and other odd jobs and things like that. And mom decided to sell her truck. And at their camp they were living in, my dad, John, he was there with his friend. And he told me recently that he decided to go there too because it was an island. So they both went to Michigan, and he was from Detroit. So two Michigan kids went down to Galveston because there was an island. And then that's how my mom and dad met. He saw the for sale sign or whatever on her truck and was like, okay, and it wasn't the best truck. He had to work on it and stuff. And there was a lot of stuff with the title. I have my mom's journal from that trip. So I really think one day it should be a movie because their trip was really insane. Like they took all back roads down. And at the time, this was the early 80s. This was like 1982. And at the time, there was a lot of serial killers. Like there was literally a serial killer in Galveston, but the three of them stuck together. And then they met my dad, and then my mom and dad started to hang out. And then Sue and I were like, uh-oh, like who's this guy? And Sue told me a story that there was a cop that was hanging around the 7-Eleven a lot. And then one time it was like at night, mom went off with dad to hang out. And they took his ID and showed it to the cop. It's like, oh, my friend's with this guy. We don't know if he's good. Can you check him out? He didn't have any crimes done in Texas. So they're like, okay, okay, I guess he's fine. And so eventually, they got their money. They went to the library to research how to do this because it was, over 1,000 miles to get back up to Calumet. And finally, they had their big day where they left. And so they basically took back roads all the way up. And then they got to the Ozarks, and there was a big storm coming through. So they met someone to fix one of their bikes, I guess. I think the story was. And he was like, "Oh, I have a girlfriend. You can kind of stay at her place tonight while the storm clears." Because the Ozarks were really crazy with the mountains and stuff, I guess, for biking. And so they decided to stay there. And they were so used to, sleeping in the back of a car or in the barn or all, all these weird places that when they were at this girl's house, they were sitting on the floor, I was told. So and then they got to Minneapolis and spent some time there, and then they biked a little more, I think, and then they end up getting a ride from somewhere in Minnesota to Calumet. And my mom always really regretted not doing the last 100 miles, but at the time, I think Heidi's bike had blown, like one of the tires had blown, so she wasn't able to ride it, so they had to do that. And so after that, my dad and her corresponded somehow, and then he ended up moving up to see her, like come and see her, and they spent time in Copper Harbor, which is like the tippy top of the Upper Peninsula. It's about 40 miles from Calumet. And so my mom was working at a hotel there, and then my dad was sleeping on the couch and at her place and got around to the church like, oh, that's not proper to have this guy you're not married to sleeping in the living room. And so he had to get his own place. But eventually, he and her fell in love in Copper Harbor, and she taught him how to make s'mores and do a sauna swim. It's sauna is how Americans say it, but it's actually sauna, which I've been corrected on by my Finnish family members. So if you hear me say sauna, that's the way it's supposed to be said. But anyway, so she taught him how to sauna swim and do s'mores, and he fell in love with her at that point. And then they got engaged. And so they had met probably May of 82, I'm guessing. And then actually I know because I have the actual day. I think they met in March of 82, and then they were married in October 23rd, 1982 was when they were married. And then I came along in July 15th of 1983. So my dad was like, "Oh, we were going to travel." And their theme song was "Let's Live for Today" by the Grassroots, and they were going to travel. But he says, I came along and I kind of stopped that. And they tried to travel with me, but it was harder to do. And so they, were traveling around, and I moved a lot as a kid. Like, spoiler alert, I moved like 7 times before I went to 7 different school districts. That's a better way to put it, before I graduated. But and so we were also living with family. We were kind of going back and forth between, because I was born actually in Phoenix, but they found it too hard for, them to be without their families having a kid. So they're like, okay, let's go back to Michigan. So after they got married, they moved to Phoenix, had me, and then moved back to Michigan. And so we were living sometimes with my dad's family, and then we lived in the Upper Peninsula, and then around mid '80s, my dad started to be a truck driver. I can't remember if it was before after my brother was born, but my brother was born in February of 1986. My brother Shane, and it's always weird to me, like thinking about his birth because I swear I was there. I remember the hospital and stuff, but I'm told to this day that it wasn't there. So sometimes I wonder if like my little psychic brain was there, kind of watching what was going on. And then my brother was born. And I was always kind of jealous of my brother because when I was born, my mom was afraid of me. And so my aunts would kind of take over, like my Aunt Debbie, my dad's sister would take over, and or my grandma or whatever. And so when Shane was born, she was all about Shane, like this is my baby, like they're really close to the point I got kind of jealous because um she was just more affectionate with him than she was with me and my mom. Maybe because I know because how she was born, she didn't show affection very often. Like I say in my book, my mom didn't say she loved me very often, but I could see it in the way she acted. She was really protective of us, and my dad was a truck driver, so he was gone a lot. So we became like a three-person unit. It was like me, mom, and Shane, and we moved around. We lived in Ohio for a while, and Escanaba, and then Escanaba is where my life starts to really come into clarity because, as a kid, you don't remember things. I remember little things like, she'd make cookies, like she made these really amazing Christmas cookies, the sugar kind. And she also made really amazing cinnamon rolls because I remember she would proof the dough and have it, these little pans covered with towels all over the house. And I could smell it and I just loved it, and I loved her cooking. Well, her baking. She wasn't the best cook. To this day, I like over hard eggs because my mom would like overcook the eggs. And we ate a lot of like hot dogs and mac and cheese. She did make a really good lasagna, but she made pasties, which is a thing that's really popular here in Michigan in the Upper Peninsula. They're Cornish, I guess, but they were made for the miners, so they're little meat pies, like handheld meat pies. And so she made those, and I remember her making those, and we loved them so much. And so we're in Escanaba, and this is where, like I said, my life starts to get really clear because I was about 7 years old then. And that's when, me and my mom start fighting because, I think I know everything because I'm a little kid. And I think her and I were a lot alike. I was literally a mini version of her because we got told so much that we were, like so, like lookalikes. We were going to do a lookalike contest in Escanaba at one point, but we missed it because my dad had taken the car and we didn't get to go. And that made me sad because my mom was super shy. Like she was a super, super shy person, but she had this quiet strength about her where she's street smart in a way, and I wonder if because those trips she took, she's very protective. Like I remember one time we had to go into a bad neighborhood in Detroit, and she was, ushering me and Shane along, go go go. Or one time we were at the mall and she was shopping. Like my mom loved to shop. She especially loved garage sales. Like to this day, when I see a garage sale, I think of her because we could never get home without stopping at a garage sale. But that one time where she was shopping and I couldn't find her, and I tried to walk out to the car and was stopped by a security guard. And they're like, Janelle, your daughter's at the customer service desk, blah, blah, blah. And she came running, panicked and stuff. And she tried her best to help me be, a strong, independent person. Like she didn't like me to cry. She said crying was for babies. I remember that very, very vividly. She didn't like when I begged. She called it begging. Like if we were at the store, I say, "Oh, mom, can I have this candy bar?" And she'd be like, "No, don't beg." And she would pull my hair. That was her thing. Like, and I would sit there and rub my head. Like she was a hard mother. She. But there were times where she was soft. Like when I would have a bad dream, I remember what after watching Snow White, and there was the evil witch, and I was super scared, and she would come sleep with me or let me sleep with her. And that was like my favorite because that's when I could be the closest to her is sleeping next to her. I remember one time I slept in her bed and she was saying I was talking in my sleep and she was asking me about my dream and stuff and she loved music. Like we always had MTV on, but her religion it's you're not supposed to dance. And so I loved to dance. Like I was like shaking my butt to Winnie the Pooh when I was little and when MTV came out, I was always trying to mimic the moves and stuff and she would get mad at me cuz I didn't understand what moves were sexual. I remember there was the Cold Heart Snake video by Paul Abdul and I taught my brother, I tried to teach my brother and a neighbor how to do the moves and I got in trouble because I didn't know, I was they're very my mom was very good at protecting me from adult things. Like she had a rule that her and my dad wouldn't swear around me. So sometimes my dad would like it'd slip out, but and they would be like, oh no. But her, I never heard my mom swear. I never even heard her yell. She was one of those parents like, I'm not mad, I'm disappointed. So I didn't want to ever disappoint her. She was interesting because I could see that she wore different hats, which I understand more now that I've kind of researched her life and everything. Because with her family, she had to be very modest. She wasn't supposed to have dyed hair, so she would try to hide it, or she would slowly be highlighting her hair so they wouldn't know that she was dyeing it. But then with my dad's family, my grandma loved makeup, so she taught my mom how to do makeup. So with her family she was one person, and then with my dad's family she was another person. And then my dad and her would go out to concerts and stuff and she'd be like a rocker chick wearing like these outfits, and sometimes I don't think I would see them very often. I've seen pictures of them, but or I would find the clothes in their house or whatever, or in our house. So growing up I understood that we had to be different people for different people. um my mom, her religion, they weren't supposed to be on birth control. That's why she was one of eight. But I had found, the birth control container and I showed it to her. I was like, what is this? And she got all huffy puffy about it. And, and I wasn't supposed to talk about it. And my dad tells a story about they were all sitting at the table and my aunt was there from my mom's sister and I had said something about birth control. I'm like, "Oh, why isn't she on birth control?" And they were like, "Oh, like how does she know what that is?" So my mom had to keep certain things secret. And I wonder to this day if they wondered why she only had two kids. So we were living in Escanaba, and mom started to not feel well a lot. She started to get these headaches, and I just remember her rubbing her head a lot, just like constantly rubbing her head. And then she started to get really sick and would get these night sweats and just get these really bad colds and fevers. And I was like, what is wrong, mom? Like, and she was starting like to feel scared and let me know she was scared because she's like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And then she got these rashes on her legs. And I'll never forget, she was house cleaning and um we got chased out of this place because the her employer was mad at her, but she had to wear these little short shorts and you could see the rash on her legs. And we went to the doctor, and this is why to this day I don't like male doctors, but this doctor was like feeling her leg really strangely, and I just got the vibe from him that he wasn't right. He was like this old man touching my mom in this way that I didn't appreciate. And he also told us that we couldn't be allergic to penicillin or moxicillin because I guess I had a reaction to it. So to this day, I put down I'm allergic to penicillin and moxicillin. And she was just really frustrated because she didn't know what was wrong with her. But, she felt fine enough to live and stuff and do her thing. And like I said, she's very strong and resilient. Finnish people have a word called sisu, which is basically like a strong, resilient, able to like overcome. So she had this, I can't complain thing. She was just going to keep going, even though she wasn't feeling well. But I remember her coming into the school sometime, this was before she was sick, to bring a Valentine's Day cake. She'd make a square cake and then a round cake, cut the round into two, and then put it on top of the squares and make this really pretty, like pink cake for Valentine's Day. And she came into the school and everyone was like, "Oh, your mom looks like a movie star. She's so pretty." And I remember the other moms were really mean to her. And I kind of felt that it was because, they felt inferior to her in some way because she looked the way she did. She's very thin. I remember I had a classmate in first grade who was 120 pounds, and mom was like, "Oh, I'm 111." So I always remembered that. She was 5'2", 111 pounds, like tiny, tiny. And she was very, very conscious of her weight. To this day, I think that's given me, things about my appearance because I was always watching her. And they say your subconscious is made from ages 0 to 8. And those were the years I was with my mom. And when we were living in Escanaba, I remember my parents would get in these fights. And I grew up being like, I don't like this. This is bad. And, we had our 3-person unit. And then my dad would come home, and then it was all about my dad. Like, because in my mom's religion, the male is like the head of the family, so you do what the male does. And so our moving a lot was because he was changing companies. And so my mom she would never complain. He'd be like, "Okay, we're moving." And she's like, "Okay." And then start packing, like not even questioning it because that's what she was, told to do. So I started seeing these fights with them or feeling this tension in the air. And then there was an incident where my mom found this ring that wasn't hers in my dad's bag, and they were running. He was chasing her around, and he broke a broom and then threw her up against the cupboard, and she ran out to the car to hide from him. And I was about to call the police on him. It was just a scary thing. And I started to see my family unit start to fracture a little bit. And then my mom started partying with this neighbor chick and going out at night. And I just didn't understand what was going on. I just felt there was tension in the air. And then when my dad came back, things changed. And I guess and now I know they were thinking about breaking up. But then they decided, okay, we're gonna try to make this work again. And my dad found a new company in Glasgow, Kentucky. And so we decided to move there, and we were actually going to have a house because to that point we had been living with family or in small houses or like an apartment once when I was born, and then mostly trailers. Like we lived in a trailer park in Escanaba. And then so we were told that we're going to have a house finally. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I'm going to get my own room. I don't have to share it with Shane anymore. And we're gonna have this huge yard to play in and all this stuff." And I remember packing and being so excited. And we my dad he would always move us in his semi truck because he was a truck driver, so we could just use his truck to move. So we were packing the truck, and I remember jumping out, and my shorts caught the closing mechanism of the truck, and I flipped around, and my head was like an inch or two from the ground, and my legs are flailing. And then mom and dad are sitting there laughing, and I'm like, "Help, help, help." Like I didn't think it was funny. Like I was like over it. Because there was this other time where they had gone somewhere, and I came home from school and no one was home, and they came back with a dirty truck, and they had been like driving around having fun, leaving me home. And I was always paranoid because I grew up during the Adam Walsh days and Stranger Danger, so I was always afraid something bad was going to happen to me. So I was really mad that they were laughing at me for hanging upside down. And then we moved to Glasgow, and pretty much immediately after we get there, my dad left and we went to the grocery store, and that's when my mom went blind. And in the first episode, I read the whole account that I wrote for my memoir. It's chapter 1 because this is the start of the actual start was when she wasn't feeling well in Escanaba, but it really came to a head when she went blind in Kentucky. And so after she went blind in Kentucky, we had to go up and see my Aunt Debbie in Rome, New York, and I really didn't want to go because I knew something was wrong. And so we get there, and I celebrated my 9th birthday up there. Actually, yeah, there in Ogdensburg, New York, where my other Aunt Karen lived. And after that, we went back to Kentucky to see my mom, and that's when we went to a hospital in Bowling Green. And I remember I was sitting in this reception area, the waiting area. There was, rows and rows of chairs, and my dad sitting me down and saying, "Your mom is sick, and the doctor says she's going to die in 2 weeks." And I was just like, "What?" Like, you can't process that as a 9-year old. You know, I mean, like, having your mother die is what they do as a bad, the worst thing imaginable for a kid. You think back on Disney movies, Bambi, or, even like Cinderella, like they all have a dead mother. Or like Land Before Time, I remember watching that. Like I literally would not step on cracks because I didn't want to break my mother's back. Like remember step on the crack and fall and break your back from that movie. And it was constantly like told to little kids, like if you lose your mom, it's the worst thing ever. It's the worst thing ever. So me sitting there at this hospital being told my mom was gonna die, I was like, what do you mean? Like it didn't feel right. And and I asked, "What was it?" And my dad said encephalitis. And so I started looking up encephalitis, and encephalitis is an inflammation of the brain. So, like after that, I was on edge all the time. Like I had already developed anxiety when the car incident happened where she went blind, but then this this I think was the beginning of my anxiety disorder. And every day it was like waiting, like what do you mean she's gonna die? Is she gonna die today, to tomorrow? And I remember she called me when I was at my aunt's because I was staying with my aunt. My aunt Debbie ended up getting guardianship of us, so we started to go to school in Westmoreland. It was Westmoreland School in New York because obviously I couldn't be with my mom, and my dad needed to be on the road making money or whatever. And so my aunt had custody of us and guardianship of us. And at that time, that's when I started to feel weird because, she would come to school and be like, "Is that your mom?" Like, "No, that's my aunt." Like, "Where's your mom?" Like, "Oh, she's sick." And all the teachers knew. And then I started getting that pity. The pity started at that time, like people feeling sorry for me because my mom wasn't around. And even before that, my grandma got remarried and my mom was at the wedding. And I remember she wore this blue dress that she had worn to my Aunt Karen's wedding, but she had this weird hat on with like a scarf holding her hair up because once she got sick, everyone stopped brushing her hair. So she had this big knot in her hair, and the blindness had continued. So she was kind of cross eyed, like her eyes would kind of gaze away from you sometimes, but she could see a little bit at times, but most of all, she couldn't. And then there's this woman with her. I have to make up a fake name, but I'll just call her um, Juniper. I'll call her Juniper. So Juniper was sold to me as her nurse, which didn't make sense to me because this woman wasn't a nurse. She was a medical transcriptionist, I guess. I don't know. But she had been friends with my dad when they were younger. And so she was at this wedding too, which I thought was really weird. And so I saw my mom at the wedding, and then I started school, and I didn't see her for a while. And then, and by this point, I was told she was going to die in probably early August of 1992. And then I saw her August 1992 at the wedding, and then the next time I saw her was for Christmas. And for Christmas, like we were supposed to be there in Kentucky, but then we were moving Juniper stuff from Boca Raton, Florida to Kentucky to help, take care of her. And then when we were in Boca Raton, I caught Juniper and my dad kissing. And then my dad was like, "Oh, when your mom gets better, I'm going to leave her and be with Juniper." And that really confused me because I was like, "What you mean she's gonna live?" And I kept getting this hope because, the 2 weeks had far surpassed the 2 weeks, and now I was being told, "Oh, maybe she might get better." So I started to get some hope, but this trip down to Boca Raton took longer than it was supposed to. And then I ended up missing Christmas. We didn't get back till very late on the 26th. So my mom is in this house in Kentucky by herself getting, and Christmas was I'm gonna start crying. Christmas was her favorite time of the year, and like this ended up being her last Christmas on Earth, and she spent it alone waiting for us. I remember I got an easy bake oven, and she was helping me with it, but she couldn't, see what I was doing, and I grabbed the pan, taking it out, and I'm glad to this day that my first time baking was with her, but it was, with an easy bake oven, and it wasn't like her teaching me how to do things. And it was just sad because, she was a shell of herself. She wasn't like the mother I remembered. Like the mother I remembered was left in Escanaba basically because once we got to Glasgow, like everything started to fall apart. And so our last Christmas was really sad, and she was alone, and I only got to spend like a couple more days with her, and then we had to go back to school up in New York. And she ended up not staying with Dad and Juniper anymore. She went up with her family, which must have been, awful for them to see their daughter and sister deteriorating the way that she was. After I completed my grade 4, I went back to Kentucky and I lived there with Juniper for a little while. And then one day, I remember I was talking to my teacher and she's like, "What does your mom have? What's happening?" And I said, "Oh, she has encephalitis." And this teacher was like, "Oh, I had encephalitis, but I got over it." And I was like super confused. I was like, okay, like then, my hope kept building and building and building. And mom had called me before this, and she had this long talk with me, and she told me how proud she was of me, and it was like a very unusual conversation. But I remember like clinging to the phone. I wish this day I remembered everything. She told me she loved me and she was proud of me, and it felt like a final conversation because she knew she wasn't going to be of her right mind for very long. And so we were down in Kentucky, and I was living with Juniper and my dad. Well, mostly Juniper because my dad was gone. And I was pulled out of school one day, or out of class, and I was told, Juniper's gonna be picking you up. Your mom's really sick, and we're gonna go see her. And so we drove from Glasgow up to Calumet, and she was at the Calumet hospital. And it was really weird because she was in this wing by herself. And then when we saw her, I had to wear a mask, hairnet, and like a gown and gloves, like, booties on my feet, like the whole 9 yards. And like I didn't really understand why. And I was trying to make light of the situation, being like, "Oh, mom, doesn't dad look funny?" And they're like, "Oh, Cassandra, she can't see." And I remember I had to leave the room and cry outside the window because I didn't want her to hear me cry because, babies cry. I didn't want to be a baby. So I went out and I was looking through that little square window at my brother, and he just looked so scared. And I was scared too, but I had to be, the big girl and be strong and everything. And I just remember touching her hand and looking at her, and then she couldn't go to the bathroom on her own, so they had to walk her to the bathroom, and she was all hunched over, and it was just like so scary. And I knew, like you just knew, I knew, everyone in the room knew that that was the last time I was going to see her. And they were saying she didn't like remember things, and I had a problem with stealing when I was young because, like I said, I would ask her for things, get my hair pulled. So I would steal candy like Rolos. I was really big. fan of Rolos or whatever. And a friend of mine convinced us convinced me that we should go to this convenience store and steal candy. So we stole like, I don't know, it was like bags of candy. So another time she was like, go do it again. My friend told me that. So I was like, okay. And then I ended up getting caught. And then my mom came and got me and told me she wouldn't tell my dad because I had been caught before and I was banned from the store and stuff. And then when we left Escanaba for Kentucky, my dad was like, "Oh, you want to get a snack at the store?" And I had to be like, "Oh no, I can't go. I don't want one," like because I wasn't allowed in there. And my mom had promised me, "I'll never tell him. I'll never tell him that you did this." And I was like, "Okay," because when she and he were fighting, I became team mom always because she was around me more than he was. And so we're back in this hospital bed and they're telling me she doesn't remember things. And we went to say goodbye. And she whispered in my ear, "I never told him." And that was the last thing my mother ever said to me. And we left the hospital and didn't go back to Kentucky. I ended up going back to live with Debbie. And so I'd seen my mom, I'm I'm guessing it was probably like mid-September. And I'm living with my Aunt Debbie. And it was a Saturday morning and my brother and I were in the kitchen and I was standing on the chair over the stove. There was some cupboards over the stove and I was standing on the chair to get my favorite cereal bowl to make cereal. And as I'm reaching for the cereal bowl, my Aunt Debbie comes in with my papa following her, my grandfather, and she's crying and like I knew immediately what it was. And she's like, "I'm so sorry, but your mom died at about 8:20 this morning." And I just couldn't say anything. I didn't go to her for a hug. I couldn't do anything. I just got off the chair and I walked around the corner. There was a little bathroom around the corner. I walked into the bathroom. I shut the door. And to this day, I don't know why I did this, but what I did, I stood there holding the sink, looking in the mirror, and I watched my eyes change. I watched my childhood drain from my face, and my eyes got really sad, and the hope was gone. Like, this miracle that I thought was going to happen didn't happen, and she was gone. And then as I'm doing this and watching my eyes change, I hear bang, bang, bang. And I was like, what the heck is that? And then I leave the room and my brother is on like the stack of blankets that because we slept in the living room and he was on the stack of blankets that we had and he was just banging on the wall. Like he was angry. I was lost. And it was just like awful. Like our worst nightmare was there. Like reality was there and there was no hope. There was no more hope. There was not gonna be any miracle. And so after that we just had to get ready for the funeral and get up there because it was, quite a drive to get up there. And I remember that whole drive being a blur and the colors were changing. Like usually before that, fall was my favorite season because I love the crisp air and the colors, and especially in Michigan, it was like gorgeous. So we're driving up there, and I remember picking out this purple dress with lace on it as my funeral dress because at the time I had just started liking Prince. So, I don't know why, but I picked that purple dress and we got up there and to the funeral and the first was the wake and I just remember seeing my family and everybody just looked bewildered and lost and like she had 7 siblings that lost their sister. She had parents that lost their daughter and you're not supposed to bury your daughter. And she was in this casket and there was all these people I didn't recognize. Like I didn't know these people because after she married my dad, she wasn't really part of the church, and so a lot of her friends like stopped talking to her. So I was really confused of who all these people were. And my mom was in this casket in this very modest blue. was like this royal blue dress with these tiny little polka dots and a white lace collar buttoned all up to her neck. Her hair had been chopped off. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring. And I just remember my brother crying, and my dad was there with Juniper. And I just wanted to, I was staring at her hands because those were the hands that fed me and took care of me and brushed my hair. And now they were in this coffin, and all I wanted to do was crawl inside of it with her, and I knew I couldn't because everyone would think it was weird. So I had to just stand there and stare at her, and I couldn't even touch her, and I wanted to just be in there with her, but I couldn't. And my cousins were looking at me weird, and I felt so lost, lost and sad. It's an indescribable feeling because I was 10 years old. She died on October 23rd, 1993.
She was 31 years old.
It was my mom and dad's 11th wedding anniversary. And now, like, everything was changed. Like, I didn't know how to be. And we had to finish, after the wake, we had the funeral, and the funeral was at her church. And I remember very, very vividly that at the time they were going to shut the casket, my aunt took me out. She didn't want to see me, see the casket closing in on my mom because that's the last time I would see her face. And so she walked me out, and then we waited a minute, and then we walked back in. And I don't remember what they said. I just remember, you know, I don't even see when I close my eyes and look at the room and try and remember it. I don't see anyone else there but her. And after that, you went to the cemetery, and it was cold and just miserable. And afterwards, we went back to my grandma's house, and we all hung out, and it was just sad. I saw more pictures from it recently, and everybody just looks bewildered, and kids were being, kids, they didn't understand what was going on. They're looking at photos, but my mom's siblings, like my uncle Glenn and my aunt Colleen and my other aunt Debbie, they all looked so lost. And really, and after that, I didn't see that side of the family after my mom died until 2017, because my dad felt like they wouldn't accept me for who I grew up to be. Um, he felt he just, he would talk about them in a way like, oh, they wouldn't understand. My cousin had stopped talking to me when I reached a certain age, so I felt like I was going to be alienated because I wasn't part of the church. So I was just like with my dad's side of the family, in Juniper. So after she died, I finished out the school year, and we had to go back to Kentucky to pack. And I just remember sitting on her couch the first time, being in that house, knowing she was dead. And Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow by the Shirelles was playing. And I just cried and cried. And to this day, I can't listen to that song because it reminds me of that feeling of emptiness. And so after that, I ended up moving with dad and Juniper to a town called Potsdam, New York. That was near my Aunt Karen, because Juniper and Karen really got along. So my dad wanted to be near her, even though I wanted to stay with Debbie and her husband Jerry. My dad was like, I need my kids with me, even though he was never home. So I was living with Juniper and going into the 6th grade. And then I turned 11 years old. And 4 days later, I got my first period. And Juniper, instead of giving me, thin, always pads, she gave me these thick, thick pads. And as I'm using them, she's like, oh, those were your mother's. So for some reason, my dad sold off my mom's clothes. They kept her jewelry and like knickknacks and things like that, but sold her clothes, but then kept her pads, which really bothered me, and the way Juniper treated me wasn't very good. And in that time, I was given her ring, like her class ring, her wedding ring, her journals, and so I was starting to know her, but I was sad, and we didn't keep pictures around, and to talk about her made everyone sad, so then we just didn't talk about her. She kind of faded into the background, and my dad had told me a story about his grandfather visiting him after he died, and I remember the Aerosmith video for Angel and how an angel would come from like the corner of a room, and I remember crying and begging my mom to come to me as a spirit. Like I begged her, and it just didn't happen. So I felt angry. I felt angry at what happened and angry at the God that she believed in that let a person like her die. I just, I became angry. And then around sixth grade, I started getting these dizzy spells where I'd had to miss school because I would just get dizzy. And now I understand that was a form of anxiety. That's how my anxiety was manifesting. And I had really bad anger issues. Um, Me and my dad would get in fights and stuff, and it was not easy, and it was not easy not having a mom. Like, I was always felt like I was an other because I would be with my friends, and I would get jealous of their mothers, or if they're fighting with their mother, I'd be like, "At least you have a mother." Like, I was very angry. My grades were okay. I was always like a B, C student, but my grades were okay. Shane got better grades, but he after she died, he didn't really talk about her much. I remember the last time we really talked about her was in Kentucky when we were packing to move. He told me, "Cassandra, I miss her. Like, I really miss mom." And I don't know where I came up with this, but I said it's like she had this crystal ball, and the crystal ball got heavier and heavier and heavier, and she just had to let it go. And that's what I said to him. And that was really one of the last times he's talked about her. To this day, he says he doesn't remember her, but I wonder if he blocked it because it's too painful. Because they were very, very close. Like I said, she was very close with him, and I was very jealous of that. Shane was only 7 when she died, so it could be that his subconscious didn't hold on to everything, but he was really sad when she died. My uncle told me a story of Shane being under a coffee table, curled up in a fetal position after she died, feeling very lost and sad. And so we had to grow up not having our mom and having to explain, oh, this is my dad's girlfriend that we were living with. And Shane got close to Juniper, but it wasn't the same. And Juniper was like a type of person who would act one way when my dad was gone, and then when he would come back, she would talk about how bad we were. I was cleaning the whole house for $5. I joke now like I was Cassandraella, like there I was with a dead mother and living with an evil not stepmother, and then they end up breaking up when I was a junior in high school, and I had to go live with Debbie and Jerry again, but this time they were living in Ogdensburg with my aunt Karen and Uncle Bob, so it was like Debbie, Jerry, Karen, Bob, their 3 kids, dog Emma, me, and Shane. And then at the school in Ogdensburg, I didn't make any friends. So I ended up moving in with a friend in Potsdam, my friend Rena, because her mom let me live there. And I paid $150 in rent every month from my mom's Social Security. And I basically ate ramen. Like, it was hard. It was really hard, but I had lived in Ellensburg and tried to go to school there, but didn't make any friends. And I had made friends in all these other schools, but I needed to be with my friends. And in Potsdam was a better school. Like they had more arts. I was really into the arts and things like that. And I had started taking dance classes, not at school, but wherever I could. And so dance was like really important to me. And that's how I started to process my feelings. And what was really hard was graduations and big life events started around that time, and I would just cry at each one. Like Shane's graduation, I cried. My graduation, I cried because the emptiness. of her, her void was super, super difficult. And we just, you want your mom there, and realizing that for the rest of my life, my mom wouldn't be at these events. And so at this point, I'm going to stop part one. And in the next episode I'll have out in 2 weeks, I'll explain the truth of my mom's death, and I'll explain how I developed a spiritual relationship with her. Thank you so much for listening, and remember forever.